It's that time of year again when most of our New Year's resolutions are a distant memory and we are knee deep in Pinterest recipes on how to bake with Girl Scout cookies. My next guest will help us understand what makes healthy living so damn hard. And spoiler alert, it's not all your fault, but there is hope. She's the leading authority in the subject matter that has ruined many a health goal: processed foods. In her 25 years of research, she's seen over 100 health conditions dissipate thanks to her holistic insights. Today is part one of our time together because it was so yummy we just couldn't put it in one episode. She's going to spill the tea on defining processed foods and the science of why we crave them. Researcher, former food addict, fact finder, Dr. Joan Ifland. Thanks for coming on to the show.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate this.
I've never been so excited to have someone on the show that I knew was going to tell me I need to break up with Chick-fil-A.
Oh, gosh. Well, there are a lot of foods out there, and they're profitable. The food manufacturers hire addiction specialists to get us addicted, but we're going to find out today what to do about it exactly. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Maybe we should start by defining what is processed food, because I feel that we all maybe think we know. I thought I know or knew, but then as I looked in my kitchen, I cook about 4 or 5 times a week. I cook a lot from scratch. But even as I looked in my kitchen, I saw things in boxes and I saw things in cans here and there. And I thought, I even like tortillas, so I would love for you to define it. And then I might even have some specific questions about that. So if you don't mind, if we could start there, that would probably set the stage.
So there are broad categories. Any kind of a sweetener is addictive. It activates the dopamine pathways. Flour is addictive. We know that it activates a serotonin pathway. Excessive salt and dairy and gluten all activate the same pathway as opium. And then you have processed fats that activate the same pathway as cannabis. And then caffeine, which activates the dopamine, and then food additives. So any time that you process a plant, anytime you concentrate a plant by either removing the fiber or cooking it a lot or powdering it or crystallizing it, you've concentrated the natural endorphins in the plant, and then it becomes addictive. There's enough endorphin to be able to hyperactivate the reward pathways, so you get a high and then a crash, and that's where the compulsion comes in.
So you're defining processed foods from the perspective of its probable addiction qualities.
Yes. And it's just kind of almost by definition, because once you've processed a food, you've also concentrated it. And so, for example, poppies don't give you a high, but when you extract and concentrate the opiate in it, then you create opium. So it's the extraction and the concentration of the plant that makes it addictive.
So what about organic foods? If I go to Whole Foods or something and I buy something in a box or a can there, does that still make it processed?
It's if it's processed, yes. Being organic is like saying, well, what if I smoked organic tobacco? It would still give you lung cancer.
Okay, that's a great analogy.
It's one of the techniques of marketers is to try to put some kind of benefit on the package to lure you to buy it. But it's like if gluten-free, highly processed foods are still processed. They're still going to get into your system quickly and create that high in the reward centers.
So what about locally sourced deer sausage?
So you would look at the label and you would see if it had sugar added to it, or maple syrup, or excessive salt. You would see what was added to it. If you want to have sausage, you would just buy your own plain ground chicken, and you would add sausage spices to it, which takes about 25 seconds.
Right.
And then smush it into patties and put it in a frying pan. And it's fabulous.
Skim milk?
So milk is a very interesting substance. Milk has the power to put a 100-pound baby calf to sleep. So that's what it is supposed to do. The calf is supposed to go to sleep after feeding so that it will absorb the nutrients. It won't be running around. So it's like a narcotic. So if it can put a 100-pound baby calf to sleep, it can do a lot to a human. There are 4 different casomorphines in dairy, and one of them has been shown to attach to the opiate receptors in the brain. So it's addictive.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this really narrows down the food choices. I've already skipped in my head to, oh my gosh, well, what do we do about all of this? Even though I've written, this outline that you and I are supposed to follow, I wonder if the listener has also skipped ahead to, well, what the heck am I supposed to do then? So maybe we should satiate that before we move on, just for the sake of keeping the listener on board with us.
It's a good question. So you just start with proteins. There are so many different proteins. There's beef and chicken and turkey and lamb and mutton. And then there are dozens of kinds of fish and shrimp and shellfish. And then, of course, eggs, and then the plant proteins, all the different kinds of beans, quinoa, amaranth. There's a lot of different kinds of proteins. And then you think about fruits. Only for somebody who's been sensitized, only the low sugar fruits are going to work. In other words, not cause cravings. And so you have all the different kinds of berries and melons and citrus, oranges and tangerines and grapefruit, and the stone fruit, the peaches and nectarines. So there's a long list of those, kiwi. So there's a lot of variety there. And then vegetables are endless. There are more vegetables than you could possibly imagine.
So buying quinoa or couscous in a package would not be considered a processed food as long as there's no added sugar in it.
Couscous is a pasta.
Oh.
So it's made from flour.
But its name is so fancy, it must be healthy.
I know. But there's a grain, millet, which it's almost indistinguishable once it's cooked and has a completely different impact on the body. Millet's very high in protein and it's non-gluten. So a lot of people can really enjoy millet, but couscous is a pasta. Orzo is a pasta. It looks like rice, but it's a pasta. Yeah.
So tricky.
Oh gosh, there's tons. I mean, when you really get into it and you set up a nice rotation and you're buying a big variety of unprocessed foods, your eye is so delighted because the colors are fantastic, and all the different textures and tastes. It takes about 3 weeks for people's sense of taste to return after giving up processed foods. But then, oh gosh, the variety of tastes is incredible.
Wow.
It's really a delightful thing to try out.
I love how positive that is, since we just, kind of started off with things that maybe are negative, but you have a light at the end of the tunnel. So what makes all of these processed foods, the flour and all the things you mentioned, what makes it so yummy to our brains?
It's the same mechanism that made cigarettes taste good. So you're too young to remember the jingle, the Winston cigarette jingle. Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Wow.
If you've ever tasted a cigarette, they taste horrible. When, the first time you take a sip of whiskey, oh my God, that tastes so bad. It's the addiction So the addiction goes over to those taste receptors and it persuades your brain that it tastes good. And so you continue to use it. Once you've gotten off of processed foods, you might be off for a couple of weeks and you go back and you taste some of that stuff. Oh my gosh, it tastes so bad. It tastes like a chemical because it is a chemical.
I agree
Yeah.
about the transition. When I stopped, I started eating less processed foods, and then I would go back to some certain food items I have very fond memories of as maybe a teenager or a child. And I'm like, why is this eating? I feel like I'm eating salt. Like this is just so
Yes.
salty.
Yes. You can really detect it. So loss of taste is one of the consequences of eating processed foods.
Oh dang! It's not just COVID. It's it's the processed foods making you not be able to taste.
No, no, we've had this for decades before COVID, and it's devastating. Before COVID hit, every day in the United States, 1,800 people died of a diet-related disease. So that means that they were not able to change their diet, and they were dying, and they weren't able to change their diet. So that just shows you the power of this addiction. It will put people in their grave.
And you've talked in lectures about how it's not a character flaw, it's not a lack of willpower, that there is a system, a very intentional system behind how these foods are developed that goes all the way, unfortunately, back to even baby formula. Can you shed some light on all of that?
So, way back in my background, I have an MBA from Stanford, 1978. So I'm very interested in business models. I worked for a corporation. I grew up in a household. My dad was a biochemist and worked in a corporation. So I understand how they work. They just need to produce profits. They've got shareholders, they've got a stock price, they've got employees to pay. They need to make profit. So the tobacco industry developed an addiction business model. They were able to get 2/3 of Americans to smoke. So it's a very effective model. It depends a lot on intensive advertising in combination with addictive products. They would heighten the addictive qualities, like they put extra nicotine into the cigarettes, and then make it available everywhere at a cheap price, target the youngest possible user. So in tobacco addiction, they targeted preteen boys with the Joe Camel cartoon campaign. And they were prevented from doing that. But then in the 1980s, three things came together. One, high fructose corn syrup came on the market. It's a cheap sweetener compared to sugar. Two, the US government started promoting processed foods in the food pyramid. The bottom row is all processed foods. And they were running into trouble with their tobacco business in the courts, the US courts. So boom, they just switched over to processed foods. In the 1985 to 87 period, tobacco bought Kraft, 85% of Nabisco, and
Whoa.
General Foods.
What? Tobacco, big tobacco. So who is big tobacco? Who
So R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris,
and
they
they
bought 10% of the U.S. food market in 2 years. And immediately, within 7 years, you see Saturday morning cartoon commercials for processed foods go from already about 160 per Saturday morning on a Nickelodeon program to 560. And Nickelodeon carried those commercials to 65 million households. So we know from research that it's that repeat exposure to a reminder of an addictive product that programs the reward centers in the brain to crave, to flood the brain with craving neurotransmitters. It's a Pavlovian conditioning process.
Well, I spoke with
And
a cult specialist in a previous episode, and it sounds a lot like indoctrination.
exactly, it's brainwashing. It's brainwashing. Small children, toddlers. And we have great research showing that it only takes 5 commercials, 5, to persuade a toddler to choose a product. And there they are on a Saturday morning seeing 500 for processed foods. So it's very clear what happened. Within 10 years, the obesity rate in children went from 10% to 15%. It's a 50% increase in 10 years. The obesity and overweight rate before tobacco came in Americans, all Americans, including children, was 45%. 20 years later, it levels out again at 70%. We just see the impact. So about 70% of Americans are now overweight or obese. About 66% of American adults smoked. You see this business model is tragically and shockingly effective. Same business model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I never thought of it as I'm I don't know, victim, recipient, whatever, of a business model. I just thought that I really felt like it was more of a character defect. Like, oh, I just have a sweet tooth. I just, in fact, my video producer, Caleb, has a question that he didn't know that you and I were going to chat today. And then yesterday we were chatting and he said, well, I'll let him tell you and then let him ask the question. So I'm going to pass off the headphones.
Okay. Hi, Caleb.
How are you doing?
Good.
So here's a crazy question for you. I am addicted to sugar 100%. Can quitting sugar cold turkey cause like anxiety, panic attacks?
Yep. So there is a withdrawal syndrome, and we have 3 different very good studies showing that sugar is worse than cocaine. It has a greater effect and it's more destructive. It alters the brain more deeply than cocaine. It's a sweet tasting, very powerful drug.
That makes a lot of sense. Can it also cause like mental lags, like to where you feel like you're moving like slower? Like whenever you're trying, because so I did, like yesterday, I was like, you know what, I'm just not gonna have any sugar today, and I felt horrible.
Yeah. You go it's about a 4 to 8 day withdrawal. Most people are through it in 4 days. You can have a stomach ache, fatigue, brain fog, more intense cravings. You can have a headache. Typically, people will get a headache because their muscles are in spasm from dropping adrenaline levels. And it takes about 4 days for the body to readjust. A lot of toxic microorganisms in the gut are dying because they feed off of sugar. So you can have digestive distress. They're a very clear withdrawal syndrome. These are drugs.
Yep.
These are drugs. The body is reacting to them like they're drugs. The body has a very distinct and different reaction to food versus drugs. And the changes in the body that we see from eating processed foods are drug reactions. So it's just crystal clear.
Epic. Thank you.
Super good question.
Wasn't that a happy coincidence?
Yeah. I'm glad he's trying to get off.
Yes.
It's wonderful to get off of it, actually.
Well, I know in our part 2 of our talk, we'll be chatting about how we can redeem our brains and what happens if we decide to keep going. But I would love to hit on in a little bit more detail how addictive like sugar and flour are. You talked about dairy and its sedative effects, which I think we'll all agree that, that we feel that with milk. And you talked about how, also dairy lights up the cannabinoid receptors in our brain, correct?
Dairy lights up the opiate receptors.
Okay.
It's got 4 different casomorphines. They're called casomorphines.
Morphines. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's the processed fats that light up it's called the endocannabinoid pathway, the processed fats.
So part of the addiction is, the system. I hate to say that, but I mean, it's just the truth. I think I heard on Sean Stevenson's podcast that one of the large pizza companies was financially incentivized to put 3 times the amount of cheese on their pizzas. And it was kind of packaged as a benefit for the dairy farmers. But how can we make healthy choices if this is the system that we live in? And then the second thing I'm hearing you say is the messaging. The messaging is everywhere from childhood. So not only is the food, not only is there sugar in baby formula, but there's, commercials about having sugar breakfast. And actually, to support that point, a small anecdote is we don't have television in a traditional sense. We just, we're not crazy. We're not animals. We have Netflix, but we don't have there's no commercials, And so I haven't seen commercials in a long, long time. And a few years back, I was waiting in a waiting room at a tire shop to get my car done. And the TV was just playing. You know what the 2 commercials were? Food and pharmaceuticals. Every other, and there was no advertisement about anything other than food and pharmaceuticals. And then if it wasn't about food, it was about food-shaped toys. Look at this donut-shaped pool float. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a problem. But it was because I had removed those things from my life that I then noticed the contrast when I was sitting in the waiting room.
Yes, this is, it's called surround marketing. So the idea is you addict to the reward pathways and then you constantly stimulate them. And so the person just gradually over the years develops nonstop thinking about food. And it doesn't have anything to do with their childhood issues. They're not lazy. They're not self-sabotaging. It's not genetic. It's none of that insanity that we're told it is. It's a mechanical problem. You have these hypersensitive brain cells. So once the product has become highly addictive, so they added nicotine to cigarettes, they added a lot of sugar, fat, salt, dairy to processed foods. A loaf of bread in 1970 was formulated quite differently than a loaf of bread in 1990. That loaf of bread was loaded up with sugar, fat, salt, and you could eat 1 slice in 1970. But by 1990, you would eat 1 slice, it would kindle, it would set off the addiction, and there you would go to eat the whole loaf helplessly. Once the brain floods with these addictive neurotransmitters, the frontal lobe is not getting enough blood supply to work. So even though you don't want to eat the whole loaf of bread, that part of the brain is not firing, it's crashed. So it's just like when your computer crashes, there's no data in and there's no data out. So that is why people, they will wake up kind of from a binge or overeating and say, I know better than that. And they will start blaming themselves. So why do I love talking about this business addiction model so much? It's because this is not your fault. I didn't ask for smoking, but I've got asthma now. I'll have asthma for the rest of my life. I grew up in a smoking household with constant bronchitis. And then I smoked myself for about 15 years from high school. When I got brainwashed, oh, this is so cool. Of course, it's not cool. It's disgusting. Up until I had my first child. So I just hope there's one thing that your audience takes away from this. This is not your fault. It's a vicious addiction. It's very deeply seated because it starts so young. It's got a lot of different substances involved. It's heavily stimulated. But you can be trained to avoid the processed foods in the culture, and especially to avoid the messaging. So it's just training. It does take years. And the thing that's really vicious and sad about what the business model does, it engages our conformance drive. So conformance drive is one of the most powerful forces in the brain. We do want to belong because for all the years of human evolution, if you belonged in a tribe, you would live.
Right.
The tribe would find food, shelter. It would make sure your babies were safe, and it would fight off predators. So belonging to a tribe was a number one priority for humans for millions of years. And we still have that. So the food industry will show, these characters like Spider-Man, because the child wants to be accepted by Spider-Man. So it's going to do what Spider-Man is doing. It's why they hire, I forget his name, but McDonald's recently did a promotion with a rap singer. And everybody wants to be like that rap singer. There's a TikTok dancer, a young woman, a 16-year-old woman. Dunkin' Donuts hired her to promote this really addictive, destructive caffeine product, a coffee, like to 16-year-old girls. So they just viciously exploit that conformance drive to get us to do things. So to get us to buy things. So we now have research showing that you have to be in your own social circle, a healthy social circle, and break free from the conformance drive that's been activated by the addiction business model, and just gradually transfer that conformance drive to healthy people. And then it's pretty cool because then everything becomes shockingly easy. No, my tribe doesn't eat that. No, my social circle doesn't eat that. No, I would never go there. No, my social circle doesn't go to that place.
I love how your approach is to use our natural human tendencies to empower ourselves and not to punish, or what's the word I'm looking for?
Judge.
Deprivate. Is that the right word?
To
punish ourselves basically. So
yeah.
I am really excited to talk about how we can redeem our brains, redeem our bodies, but what happens if we don't, and then what the listener can actually do, which is part 2. So stay tuned next time when we will talk about all of that. And if you're not already in the loop, subscribed to our emails, just text REAL to 66866, and then you'll definitely get that memo. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.